Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are tuning in from. Thank you so very much for joining us. It is a pleasure to have you. I am Terri-Karelle. I hail from the beautiful island of Jamaica, and you can call me your moderator, your host, your MC, your chief experience officer. It is great to be here. Now, for those of you who had the opportunity to hear the rainfall, you heard the raindrops, and then you saw those beautiful words, that is actually an excerpt from A New Kind of Rain, a poem that was written by St. Lucian playwright and poet MacDonald Dixon. And interestingly, that poem is one of the first two pieces published in ADA, the Commonwealth Foundation's literary magazine. And they'll also be uploading more creative works, more creative writings between February 2024 to June 2024. For those of you who want to discover and explore even more of the creative expressions that we have, please go ahead and visit adastories.org. That is ADDASTORIES.org. Now, I told you I'm Terri-Karelle, hailing from the beautiful island of Jamaica. Where are you from? I see Trinidad and Tobago, I see Malta, I see Dominica, Jamaica, Bahamas, Guyana, St. Lucia. I think I saw Haiti, Kijanoye, Haiti. I see my Belizeans, St. Kitts and Nevis. I've seen all my neighbors. I know we have persons from Canada, Cayman Islands, Grenada, the Spice Isle, New York. I see USA, I see UK. Wherever it is you are tuning in from, thank you so very much for being here. Your voices really, really matter. And before we jump into this regional conversation, give me one word that describes how you are feeling right now. Before we dive into our conversations, if there's just one word that could describe how you're feeling, what emotion you might be feeling, drop it in the chat and let us know. Someone says feeling excited. We love that. That's a great way to start off our conversation. Someone's inspired, connected, energized, optimistic, intrigued, blessed, excited. I absolutely love these words. They're all very, very positive. Someone said curious. We stay curious. I see grateful. I see hopeful. Fantastic words. For me, I think my word is optimistic. We understand the challenges that we face within our small island states, our small emerging markets. We understand that the challenges are not unique to us. We face them locally. We also face them regionally. But the reason why you are here is because you represent organizations and groups. You come with a wealth of experience and expertise and knowledge when it comes to finding solutions to some of the biggest problems. So this is a Commonwealth for All, Caribbean and the Americas regional conversation towards the 2024 People's Forum. And you represent cultural activism, change makers, the regional advocates, the consultants, the experts. You also represent climate change activists, the freedom of expression, the health justice warriors, those of you who take on the battle when it comes to socio and cultural changes, creative advocates, social justice, whichever category you fall in. We understand that there is intersections and intersectionality. And so we know that even though we might be discussing three key thematic areas today, which is freedom of expression, climate justice, and health justice, we understand that we will also be including other areas and themes as we speak. Now, we have great speakers, great moderators, and we cannot wait to have this discussion. And why is this important? This is the first regional conversation of 4 as we lead and we get closer to the People's Forum. And this forum is extremely important because it is by far the largest platform where civil society, people like you and I, will come together and exchange ideas, the urgent issues, things that we've noticed, and solutions, because at the end of the day, the Commonwealth Foundation wants to ensure that even though the dialogue and the conversation is important, this is not a talk shop. The question is, what are the next steps? What are the insights? And how do we carry those insights to the very important biennial Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting that will be taking place in Samoa? So we're going to have a plenary. We're going to sit down and have a conversation with 3 panelists, and then we will break out into our breakout sessions, again, covering health justice, climate justice, freedom of expression, and we invite you to listen, to be curious, to participate, and to foster this environment of understanding. And of course, we will come back for the final main plenary when we discuss what took place. We will swap notes, and then of course we will look forward to the very next regional discussion. So are we ready? If you are ready, let us drop it in the chat and let us have this discussion. Again, thank you so very much for representing your organizations, your companies, as well as the various. Somebody said, let's go, I'm ready. And that is what we absolutely love. During the People's Voice, which was a critical conversation last year in November of 2023, there were key areas that were highlighted. The need for inclusion in all of these discussions. Where are our people with disabilities? There is the need to foster cross-sector collaboration and partnerships to galvanize our region. Are we creating and supporting capacity building platforms for us to share all of this information? We're also looking at climate justice. What is the litigation and what is the legal framework that allows us to protect our states when it comes to climate change and health? How do we become great policymakers to ensure that everyone has access to good health care? And what about freedom of expression? Our media, our journalists continuing to educate and enlighten our citizens, and holding government and policymakers and legislators accountable. And of course, we, as a part of the Caribbean, as a part of the Americas, we want to have a seat at the table where our perspective is listened to and respected, and our input is seen as being extremely significant in terms of building the resilient future that we want. So we are ready, and I can't wait to dive into this conversation. Someone says, without inclusion and amplification of marginalized voices, policies cannot be effective. And that is why your participation, your contribution, and your presence here are very, very important to us. So I told you we're going to start off with our panel discussion. We have 3 panelists. We will be looking at the thematic areas: freedom of expression, climate justice, and health justice. My very first panelist, who I take pleasure in introducing to you, is Michael Lees, representing the beautiful island of Dominica. Michael Lees is a filmmaker and photographer from Dominica. And in 2020, he released his debut documentary, Uncivilized, which saw him survive a Category 5 hurricane alone in the forest. The film premiered at the Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival, winning awards at festivals in Barbados, Guadeloupe, and Italy. Ladies and gentlemen, let us see those emojis, those clappy hands, as we welcome Michael Lees from Dominica. Welcome, welcome, Michael. Good to have you. Can you guys see him? Someone is saying, yes, Michael, I see the clappy hands. Our next panelist, who will definitely be representing freedom of expression. Of course, Michael will be representing climate. But this person, Karyn Pugliese, representing Canada. We're sending her lovely, warm hugs and kisses and the Caribbean sunshine her way. She's currently the editor-in-chief of Canadaland and occasionally a guest panelist on CBC's Rosie Barton's show. She worked as the managing editor of CBC's investigative unit, overseeing the team at the Fifth Estate and Marketplace. She's best known for her work as a Parliament Hill reporter and as the executive director of news and current affairs at APTN. Karyn, thank you so very much for being here, and thank you for all that you do. And I did say that there are 3, and I just introduced 2. So last but not least, I welcome Margaret Lawrence, representing Guyana, Caribbean mainland. And of course, her role here, we're looking at the theme, health justice. She's the executive director of Merundoi, Incorporated, a non-governmental organization specializing in behavior change communication through public education using the radio serial drama Merundoi. Karyn, Margaret, Michael, thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Oh,
welcome.
Thank you. Fantastic. Now, we know that we don't have a lot of time and everyone is ready to go. I'm going to ask this question to each of you, and based on your theme, based on your knowledge, based on your expertise and your insights within that particular theme, you can answer respectively. Michael, I will start with you, and the question goes for Margaret and Karyn as well. Based on your work, based on what you have done, based on what you have seen, what are the key priorities or challenges specific to the Caribbean region that you have observed within your respective field of work?
So there's a lot of challenges. I think, especially in the islands in the Caribbean, we also fall into that small island developing states category, and so we're extremely at risk. So you have issues like sea level rise, ocean acidification, but one of the biggest ones obviously is hurricanes, which we're seeing an increase of, and obviously with our kind of topography, it also makes it challenging when these sorts of disasters hit. People are sparsely spread out, and with the steep topography, it can be hard to reach people. It can be very expensive to repair the infrastructure when they're damaged. And then I think it's also a serious challenge trying to protect the natural buffers we have, such as the ocean and the forests, when we are in a sort of global system that oftentimes you're often trading, these resources oftentimes for material wealth, essentially, and so it can be hard to protect. I think other big ones that come to mind are food security, energy security, and renewables. Currently, I think over about 90% of our energy is imported. So yeah, these I would say are some of the challenges we face.
Oh no, I absolutely appreciate your commentary, and I actually have a follow-up question, but I'm going to allow Margaret and Karyn to come in where we can talk about the preservation or the lack thereof of how we are preserving our natural resources. But Margaret, I'll come over to you based on the work that you do using creative expression to help with public learnings, to educate in terms of awareness. What are some key priorities you have noticed, challenges specific to our region?
Thank you, Carrie, and good day, everyone. Several, and it is quite key that the previous speakers, Michael, talked about climate change, because they all are so interrelated, and climate change is going to affect the health and health justice in the Caribbean countries. But however, being a member of the International Planned Parenthood Federation and also carrying out some of the projects now, I know that there are some challenges like enacting policy and legislation to guarantee comprehensive sexual education for youth in and out of school, removing the legal barriers that limit access to sexual and reproductive health information, so in and out of school youth. There are the issues of gender-based violence, which is recurring across the Caribbean, particularly among the affecting women and girls. There is the issue of migration. Migrants are moving across Guyana and Trinidad, across the Caribbean, and how do we deal with ensuring that there is adequate health here for these migrants who most times do not speak English, and we're accustomed. So it comes up with a lot of creative ways that we have to engage them in some of our work within the regions, because we do have several Amerindian populations within the regions. It is a challenge that we have now to, like, if we're going to be using public service announcements, we're going to be doing skits or whatever, you must engage the population how they understand you. So you find yourself, you have to have a translator when you're doing your out to school or your street theater outreaches, whether it's Warao or Mapuche, whatever the languages are. There are like 9 languages. So that is a challenge. Mental health, Harry, is so very important. Mental health is affecting our population, be the children, the young people, seniors, and all are so interrelated with climate change, with climate justice. And I know that my colleague from Canada is going to talk about freedom of expression, which you find also, yes, when we some of the challenges when we want to access some populations, you are given a negative shoulder, you are not allowed freedom to communicate because it becomes political. And you want to stay away from that because you're not going in there to do politics. You're going there to carry messages that can help and impact on the lives of the populations that you want to reach. So those are some of the challenges that we reach. Thanks, Karyn.
Oh, thank you so very much for that. And I actually see someone here, Minakashi, I think, who says gender-based violence is a very serious problem, even globally. So that definitely resonated. Karyn, I think that was a perfect segue for me to come across to you. You know, it is as someone said, the politicization of social activism. You are here to represent, you know, freedom of expression and how important it is for our journalists, our reporters, our media houses to be able to be objective, to hold people accountable, to enlighten and to educate people, as Margaret said, in all walks and the cross sections. Talk to me about the challenges, the key priorities or the challenges that you see or you find in your field.
Sure. So I think, you know, Canada has things well figured out, but not perfectly figured out. And so we do run into problems, and Canada does have that image of being like the good guy country. But it's important to know that there's challenges here too. So I've got three that I kind of wanted to talk about. One of them is access to information, internal decisions that get made by governments, how decisions get made, how contracts get signed. We used to have a fairly effective system of access to information, but the government hasn't funded it properly, hasn't kept it up properly. So very often now, citizens or journalists who are trying to find out how decisions get made are waiting years to get internal documents back. And by that point, you might not even have the same government in power. So that ability to hold to account is flawed by the system being flawed and not being able to get access to information. A second issue that we really face is diversity in media. It's becoming more diverse at the lower levels of media, like entry-level positions, but we find that diverse reporters are not staying in the media and certainly aren't moving up to managers or decision-making levels. This is important because who is the media for? Who is choosing and selecting the stories? What stories get told, and who are you talking to? Well, we consider there's objectivity in media by which we need balance and fairness. Views don't come from nowhere. There's lived experience, there's connections to communities that is very important to have in news media. And if you don't have those represented, you are missing stories. A very good example of this has been, we talked about gender-based violence. Indigenous women face a higher level of Indigenous or gender-based violence than any other group in Canada. And there was a problem with missing and murdered Indigenous women being overrepresented and under-investigated. So for years, this was not a story in the media, but Indigenous women had to go out in the street and march and hold vigils in order to get attention drawn to the issue, and even to capture a serial killer that was operating for years out in BC. The third issue, which has become very important, is police actions. And this again shows up against homeless and in other areas as well, but particularly against Indigenous people who are asserting rights over land. Very often there are contracts given either to private entities or their crown corporations who want to develop land or want to make developments on land that's unceded or that is treaty land or is protected. In the courts, they have decided that Indigenous people must be consulted, but do not have a veto over projects. And so in the end, the projects are always going to go through. There's always going to be a yes, because you don't have a veto. Often, this is not acceptable to Indigenous people or parts of communities. So they will protest and they will try to block pipeline construction or dam construction on their land. Police have set up exclusion zones, sometimes keeping reporters more than 22 kilometers away from the protests. And we can't see what's happening. We can't record violence that's occurring against Indigenous people who are asserting these rights. So that's become a growing area of concern. So those are the three I wanted to talk about today.
Thank you so very much. As you were speaking, Matthew Aubrey, his comment is the continued erosion of public trust in governance and the increased polarization of politics in the Caribbean create an environment that disincentivizes activism and citizen engagement. We need to create safe and meaningful spaces for stakeholder input and civil society contributions, which is actually why we're gathered here, because we understand that there are barriers. We understand that there are from political to social to cultural factors that affect the effectiveness, but we're still hopeful that if we continue to dialogue, we continue to exchange our regional knowledge, that we will actually galvanize in areas. Matthew, I'm coming back to you. You were in Dominica. You did your film, Uncivilized. You said you were supposed to be out there for 6 months. Instead, you were there for 3 months because of the hurricane. And when you kind of came out of your little hut or the little palm leaf that you were probably in, you realize the devastation of the island. And Dominica is quite known for its rainforests, the rivers, just the beautiful nature of it. Do you think in the Caribbean's attempt to modernize and to urbanize and to build the skyscrapers and the highways and everything, that we are indeed forgetting the importance of balance between what makes us beautiful versus us being futuristic and modern?
That's a tough one, because I want to say yes, but the more people I've talked to in different parts of the world, it almost seems like this sort of like march towards modernization and capitalism is almost inevitable when you can't, for instance, isolate Dominica or the Caribbean from the rest of the system that's going on. And if you don't have some of these things, then of course people will leave and go elsewhere. So it's an important thing, trying to strike that balance. I think what's interesting is trying to build off of traditions and histories to incorporate things that have historically worked and worked with nature into our sort of new designs. So for instance, we have what is known as a tikai in Dominica, and probably something similar throughout the Caribbean. It's a small wooden house. But it was amazing to see a lot of these houses survive Maria extremely well because of the way they're built. So they're traditionally built with local wood, and they're built with joinery rather than metal screws. So actually over time, the joints get stronger rather than weaker. And so that's just, for instance, one example of something that is very easy to look at and see it as poor or humble or something that you want to stray away from because we want glass skyscrapers and everything else. But if you look closely, the quality and love that go into making those sorts of things are actually what I think in many ways are going to help us survive this sort of new climate crisis era that we're stepping into.
And I appreciate your answer, because my next question was going to be, can you share any innovative or creative approaches that you have encountered or implemented to address climate-related risks that would be for you? I know you mentioned, for example, how we build, the materials we build. Anything you want to add before I go to Margaret and Karyn?
Yeah, definitely. So I think through Uncivilized and then the work I've been doing, I've actually got to have a lot of access to interesting projects that kind of fill this sort of space. So one that I thought was really cool is it's called the Vetiver project. And so vetiver is a grass that the roots are extremely fibrous and go down maybe 10 feet deep. And so I was working on a project with Vonnie Roudette from St. Vincent, and she's done projects in St. Vincent and here. And essentially it works as a land stabilizer. So you grow it in contours along steep parts of your land, which in Dominica we have many of. And it helps stabilize the soil and prevent landslides. I saw a guy that actually did it almost down what looks like a cliffside to the river. I have no idea how he got there. And he showed me where the river went above, and everything, including the grass, held perfectly. So I think as well, like low cost, easily implemented solutions like that are going to be interesting. And then I would just say from my own perspective as a filmmaker and photographer, new stories. I think new stories and new ways of thinking about these things is important. So even in Uncivilized, a large theme was sort of questioning this idea of linear progress, and that essentially the Western countries are this like ultimate goal that we're trying to get to, and thinking more in terms of circularity and appreciating, like I said, the important traditions and culture that we have. I also worked on a cool project called the Caribbean Cyclone Cartography, also known as the Surviving Storms Project. One aspect of that was oral histories and having farmers who've experienced storms and you know, the ups and downs of the farming economy here tell their stories, as well as a cool little series we did called Creative Repair, where we featured different artists who had made art out of Maria, and sort of how they weaved these narratives of art and healing together to create something original. And very lastly, I've been doing some work with Project SETI, who their goal is to decode sperm whale language. And I think what's really interesting with them is that a lot of the ethos actually comes from trying to drive people to think more about the environment and about the climate, and realizing that there are infinite papers that have already said exactly what's going on. But until you're able to sort of captivate the public imagination enough, you know, nothing is necessarily going to happen. So all of that, again, tying together to say that I think creative storytelling is very important to get public buy-in.
Well, first of all, congratulations on all the projects you're doing. I'm quite happy that we have this forum, that we can see how persons have identified issues, but also identified solutions and are using these solutions. I particularly like the fact that we can still repurpose things that are damaged or are waste. How can we repurpose? How can we recycle? How can we reuse? Benita says, well said, Michael Lees. Listening and valuing traditional knowledge provide many answers to addressing impacts of climate change. And I see disaster management framework can be a lot of support to manage the emergency. So Margaret, I'm coming across to you. We just heard Michael kind of give some, you know, innovative and creative approaches as he tackles climate justice. For you, it's health, public health concerns. Talk to me about some approaches and some innovative ways that you've seen or you've implemented to help us with that.
Thanks, Terry. And as Michael spoke about the planting of that particular material,
Grass.
It brought me back, the grass, right? It brought us back to one of the projects that we have. Naturally, it's the mangrove that we use to keep the earth together and to preserve that barrier. Some people have been cutting it down for whatever reason, but there is now a consistent effort to ensure that the mangrove is grown back and all of that. In terms of the climate change also, as it impacts on health justice, we've just done a project with UNESCO. And because we know that the young people are our gatekeepers, we had a project called Youth Slam Climate Change, a spoken word competition. And it's amazing what those young people came up with. And they just slammed us as adults for using and doing stuff that they say, I mean, how can you keep saying that you're not going to be using styrofoam boxes and you put something
But you
in.
do.
But you do. Where are the rules that enforce this? What are you doing? You know, the guy who once said, I'm speaking for the trees. The trees are there. They're saying something. And you're telling me as a child, why don't I go outside and play? Go and play where, you know? It was just amazing. But coming back to the health, we have used our performing arts to impact and to send messages. There's an EU project that we're doing now in regions 1, 7, 8, and 9, where we're impacting on the vulnerable populations, the populations who they are indigenous people, and also some of the migrants from Venezuela. So the challenge there is ensuring that we communicate effectively in whatever language. So most of the drama that we do, we have interpreters, and the thing about street theater, when we go into these villages, it's Forum Street Theater, and Forum Street Theater enables you while you're carrying out that drama to stop and talk to the listeners, to the crowd, the audience, and they're able to enact with you. So I'm telling you that I don't think that you should. Let's get a scenario. When your husband comes home drunk, that you should do X, Y, and Z, and you are able to stop and talk with the audience and say, do you do that? What do you do when that happens? How can you ensure that it doesn't develop into some sort of violence and something happens to you? What do you do when your child, and these are some of the scenarios that come out from some of those areas, when your child is 13 years old and is impregnated by her stepfather, the man who's living there with me and who's providing for us. Who do you tell? And who do you trust in the area? So the street theater is a really, really impacting form of drama that we can use to communicate with them. The other part of one project that we're doing, because we realize that some of the women in the villages, women and girls, need to be empowered. They need to be independent because they are dependent so much on men who go into the gold fields or the mines or whatever. We have to build their capacity. So one of it is training them in entrepreneurship, or what sort of product or industry you think you want to do, and you develop them, and you're giving them some seed funding so that they can become a little more resilient and to deal with the challenges of having to depend on somebody to have food at the table and so on. So those are some of the approaches that we have used. Yes, and the other thing is that you must involve the village leaders. Now, the village leaders, we call them the two shows, and they say what happens within that village. And if you don't get buy-in from the two shows, you're in there no way, honey. You know what I mean? So
yeah, no, absolutely.
Yes. And the thing about it too, that we found that there are certain rules and regulations concerning, let's say, like, who do you sell alcohol to? And the two shows and whoever are supposed to ensure that this happens. But what do you do when you find that the two show is one of the people who's selling the alcohol? It's a lot of challenges that you have to deal with. So it's like rules and laws and so on that you have to lobby the government and to ensure, and also have the buy-in of your fellow NGOs and civic society, that these are the challenges, this is what we have to do.
Correct. I appreciate that. Drama, song, dance. I mean, historically, we have always sent messages and communicated through dance, song, and drama. I think also listening to your conversation there, you also pick up insights and informal data that sometimes governments don't have. When you get information and feedback from the persons, the different citizens that you go and you meet, you start to collect your own data. And certainly someone says that, I think they were speaking about women groups creating self-help group with seed funding can create income generating activities, which I absolutely believe. And yes, exactly. For many community leaders, you need to get the buy-in because there's a lot of subculture and a lot of control in smaller sects and smaller groups. And so we have to be able to get through to the community leaders to get their buy-in and their participation. Karyn, I know I'm running out of time, but I'm coming to you. How do you center and address the needs of marginalized communities in your work, understanding that we want to ensure that no one gets left behind? Big responsibility. Yeah. How do you do it?
So diversity is something that I think we're making a bit of progress on in Canada. One of the things, I sit on the board of the Canadian Association of Journalists for years. I spoke earlier about a lack of diversity in media. There was no way to measure diversity in media. People had tried sending out surveys, et cetera, to try to gauge, how diverse media is in terms of their reporters, their journalists. After the Black Lives Matter movement happened in the US, that resonated up in Canada. And for the first time, the Canadian Association of Journalists was able to get people to respond to a survey. We've now done it 3 years in a row, so we're starting to be able to track. And people are starting to see that this is important. Another big innovation that Canada did was, of course, the launch of the Aboriginal People's Television Network. which is now 24 years old. That was unique because it's broadcast mandatory carriage into every home in Canada. Although now that TV is becoming less of a thing, the online is becoming more important. But it had a huge impact, even if Canadians weren't tuning into it en masse, and it really was Indigenous people talking and speaking to Indigenous people. It had a big influence on other journalists because they started to see how their stories were so different and what they were missing by not being in communities, and sort of starting to be embarrassed that they were missing stories, or that they were maybe missing the point or not being as inclusive as they should. So that was very important. A few other things that happened. You're probably aware that Canada was looking for a seat in 2020 on the United Nations Security Council. And that made Canada very sensitive to international perspectives on Canada. And, you know, Canada at that time was also hosting a global press freedom conference for media. I was part of that. I was the only Indigenous person that was invited from Canada to be on that panel. But we were able to use it to draw attention to some of the problems that were happening in Canada, telling Canada, what's great that you want to lead press freedom, but what about what's happening here? What about the exclusion zones? What about the arrests of journalists? What about the violence that Indigenous journalists are experiencing in Canada, and other marginalized journalists as well? So we were able to attract attention to that. And actually, the UN did reach out to me and ask me to write a report on what it's like to be a female Indigenous journalist operating in Canada. Nobody had ever asked before. So there was no like secondary sources on this. So we did some primary research and just interviewed 12 journalists, and we were able to get that out. So having that sensitivity to international pressure was important. I just want to say on the other issue of the arrests of journalists and these exclusion zones where police were keeping journalists away, we were able to make some progress through the court system. We were able to get those issues in front of the courts, and the courts did acknowledge that journalists have the right to be there. Arrests of journalists have continued. There was just one a few weeks ago, because there's no consequences, unfortunately, for police. They will arrest a journalist who is trying to get close to arrest.
Uncover.
And it goes to courts. The courts throw it out. So for the first time in 2020, a photojournalist who was arrested, Amber Bracken, launched actually a civil case against the police. So that's going forward to try to create a consequence for police when they arrest journalists, falsely arrest journalists. So we'll see how that case plays out. But those are some of the innovations that we're doing in Canada and some areas where we're making progress.
No, that's absolutely fantastic, and congratulations. I know sometimes we try to push the needle and it feels as if we're fighting an uphill battle, but we understand, well, in Jamaica, we say every mickle make a muckle. So we understand with every short change or small change, it has a very big effect. My question to you, and I guess for everyone, as we're having these conversations, and probably if everyone can give me an answer within a minute so that we can head to our breakout sessions, is as we continue to have these conversations, how can we ensure that our policymakers, our legislators, our journalists, our media houses, everyone who is a major stakeholder is not just performing, but that it becomes a part of the psyche and the culture and the social fabric of who we are? Michael, you have a minute. No pressure, go.
How does it?
How do we ensure, for example, that climate change and climate activism isn't something that we treat as that's their problem, but that everyone now takes it on as a responsibility? It's not performance, it becomes a part of who we are.
I think the crucial thing is to try and get everyone to realize that it's their problem too. I was recently speaking with someone who is an educator, and she was saying when she was teaching climate change stuff to young kids, that was their first thing. But they're like, why are we learning about this? How does this affect me? And one of her things was to actually go back and start actually teaching about ecosystems and let the kids understand how everything is plugged in and connected and how it affects them. And I think that also as time progresses, we're all going to feel it enough that we
can't ignore it. We won't be able to ignore it. Margaret, in a minute, how do we make it a part of our psyche to communicate, to go down into the trenches, to make sure that no one is left behind as we try to educate around public health concerns?
Definitely, we have to have the buy-in of the governments. And I saw one of the recommendations that came out of CHOGM 2022, is that we have something that ensures that governments take account, are held accountable, and there is a legal something that they go to all these conferences and they pledge, and you go to the COPA, the this, the that, and the Toro. Oh yes, we will do X, Y, and Z. Come back home, nothing happens.
Nothing.
And your Commonwealth is a strong enough body to be a lobbying force and to ensure that it happens.
That things get done. And Karyn, in
Yes.
a minute, how do we ensure that even the stories we carry are not just a spur of a, oh, there's pressure, oh, we got to do this now, but that this becomes something that is a part of everyday news, everyday business?
Yeah, I think you can definitely hold journalists to account. Listen, our lives are public, but I think it's important for people to realize that journalists aren't just there. Like, I do my job for the public; it's a public trust, and so hold me accountable, but also please support me, because the industry has been in a bit of a financial crisis. There are like disinformation sites out there. It's important to know the difference, and it's important to know that the work that we do is for the good of democracy. That's why journalism is protected often in constitutions. It's there for a reason. We don't have journalism because we have democracies. We only have democracies because we have journalism.
I appreciate that. That is a fantastic way to close out. I see persons saying, that they absolutely think that things like climate change should be something that is shared at the basic level and at all levels, all the way up to university. Thank you so very much to Michael, to Karyn, to Margaret. I know that these topics are huge, vast, deep, and that 30 minutes certainly is not enough. But I thank you so very much for giving us even some insight, some solutions to the challenges across climate justice, health justice, as well as freedom of expression. You've certainly helped me to successfully close out part one of this regional conversation. We now move to part two, which means that we will now have breakout sessions again across the thematic areas of freedom of expression, climate justice, and health justice. I don't know about you guys. I was actually in one of the freedom of expression groups, and one of the participants just thanked Karyn as the facilitator. She said she's walking away feeling so empowered, that she found it to be empowering and refreshing. So I know that many of us were stuck in our various breakout sessions. I just wanted to share with you just some key insights from each session, if you will. From freedom of expression, we had one of the insights being overcoming self-censorship through community empowerment. It's crucial to implement community governance mechanisms that empower marginalized groups. This includes integrating information, education, and communication strategies, Freedom of Information Act, and education to overcome barriers faced by marginalized communities. Another insight was ensure advocacy and expression is relatable and personal. By highlighting personal stories of individuals directly affected by climate change, advocacy, and climate groups can forge a stronger emotional and intellectual connection with their audience. And the final insight from that particular great breakout session was the use of freedom of expression to encourage government accountability and improve health outcomes. Make sure that they allocate the resources to ensure people are heard. Ask them to be bolder and braver in their own freedom of expression and advocacy. In the other breakout room, still within freedom of expression, we saw insight number one, cultural policing. Good children should not speak up, and institutional policing, no system of checks for political leaders of opinions. And the suggested solution was media ambassadors to make politicians accountable. I absolutely agree with that insight. Another one, no democracy without diverse journalism i.e. more storytelling from voices that are marginalized, and creative education, encourage critical engagement. So we see where there are some similarities between the two breakout sessions. And lastly, freedom of expression means different things to people of power and the public. We need to suggest a public language of communication, media literacy as a bridge to make information accessible on climate justice, for example, to those in disadvantaged backgrounds. And I want to thank all of you for participating, and of course, the facilitators and the moderators. So let's go to climate justice. In breakout room number 2, we look at the most insightful insights, which was build on existing coalitions and strengthen these to present a unified front and avoid duplicating efforts in the region. We don't need to gatekeep. We can actually collaborate and see how we can assist each other, how we can strengthen, how we can galvanize. Be strategic and push for advocacy that fits with government's 4 to 5 year terms while still keeping long-term change in mind. Key action to ask from leaders at CHOGM is on climate justice should be for more financing loss and damage funds. So again, more financing loss and damage funds. Also in climate justice, the other breakout session, we have education, including informal education and creative approaches are key to addressing climate change. Education needs to start early as young minds have more capacity to absorb knowledge and children are very aware of injustices. The need to address inequalities. People who are suffering have less capacity to worry about issues such as climate change. Capitalism is a challenge. The dominant economic system is incompatible with sustaining life. We need healthy ecosystems and access to finance. And finally, within the climate justice discussion, youth are leading movements raising awareness about climate change, but they also have access to opportunities, leaders, resources, knowledge, and capacity to produce innovative ways to address climate change. And finally, health justice was the next topic of conversation. And in one breakout session, it said, we need to transcend silo-based approach to health and climate justice that is hampering progress. More transdisciplinary approaches need that recognize intersectionality and interrelatedness of these issues. Insight number 2, use the power of Commonwealth to promote best practices using a standardized consultation model, establish structures and incentives to promote civil society participation. And insight number 3, elevate trust among CSOs in Caribbean in their own ability and move key issues forward. And finally, in our final breakout room on the health justice, we need a safe and enabling environment. This is the key to unlocking climate and health justice, freedom of expression, etc. More protection for journalists to speak up and updating our constitution in the Caribbean would be a step in the right direction. And our final 2 insights are the connection between policies and the people must be improved, as this needs to start from the grassroots level. People need to understand that their stories are worth sharing and funding to get resources in order to participate in advocacy. And finally, funding and creative solutions should be prioritized in order to fill some of these gaps, these problems, these challenges we are seeing in the region and scale up the efforts in tackling issues in the 3 thematic areas. Wow. All I can say is, wow. And we know that the conversations had overlaps and intersectionalities, and we just want to thank you so very much for participating. I know when we started off at the beginning of the regional conversation, I asked you for one word that described how you were feeling. And I'm going to repeat the question now that we've had all of this exchange and this dialogue. Give me the one word that now describes how you're feeling after this conversation. If you had one word to describe how you're feeling, what would it be? Someone says inspired, hopeful, optimistic. I love that word. Hopeful, enriched, connected, motivated, thoughtful, encouraged. You guys are coming at me. Motivated, informed. Very good. I was extremely informed and enlightened, re-energized. Thank you, Jose. Engaged, emboldened. We love that word. Committed, dedicated, still feel intrigued and informed, more encouraged and thoughtful. Thank you so very much. So again, I mean, this kind of conversation, someone said they felt heard, visible, valued. We appreciate that. Someone says confident and thankful and grateful. Thank you so very much. We appreciate those words. They're extremely positive, and it's a positive note to close off. We want to thank all of our speakers, our panelists, our moderators, our facilitators, our note takers, the hardworking team of the Commonwealth Foundation. Thank you for creating this space. This is just one of 4 as we move forward to the People Forum. And of course, all roads lead us to Samoa. So the conversation does not stop here. For those of you who have not signed up as yet, please go ahead and sign up to the foundation discussion page. That's a space for activists, for practitioners, for artists, for civil society leaders. Let us stay connected because there's a lot of work to be done. We will continue these discussions. I know that we have a QR code that will be put up. You can link to join the chat. These are discussions that will continue, as I said, on our journey towards Samoa for the People's Forum, where we will literally flesh out all of the solutions we have to the Caribbean's leading challenges. We certainly hope that you will go ahead and follow us on Twitter, on social media at Commonwealth ORG, and look out for a survey. We'll be sending you a survey that you can share with your communities so that we can collect more data, more insight, more understanding of what other people outside of us believe, think, and perceive. It has been a pleasure serving you in the capacity of your Chief Experience Officer. I just saw some persons typing in the chat. There is your QR code. Go ahead and sign up, become a part of the online discussion group. Let us not be strangers. Let us not be talk shops. Let us now go and hold people accountable. Let us go and partner and collaborate with other people who have shared goals, shared visions, shared dreams, because we do believe that the Caribbean, the Americas, can be sustainable, democratic, peaceful, and resilient. Again, I am Terri-Karelle. It was a pleasure serving you as host, as moderator, as Chief Experience Officer, and I look forward to the many other discussions we will continue to have. Again, thank you for joining us, and thank you to the Commonwealth Foundation and the team for making this possible. I wish you all the best for 2024. Please take care. Bye-bye.